Hi everyone, Nick here from Conservation Careers and welcome to the podcast. Now, when we look across the conservation movement, we see a stark lack of diversity within the sector. There are imbalances against what you'd expect to see regarding gender, race, ethnicity, religion, disability, sexual orientation, and more. We see bright young people from diverse backgrounds interested in wildlife conservation and really wanting to engage, but all too often dropping away because of inherent biases in the way that we train, recruit, and support them within the movement. And here to talk about this and more today is Cade London. Now, Cade is a fifth-generation Hawaiian, and he's the manager of an exciting cross-organizational alliance called the Diversity Joint Venture for Careers in Conservation. And together, they're on a mission to strengthen the conservation workforce by increasing diversity and equity and inclusion. Now, in this episode, we discuss the diversity deficit within conservation, why it matters, how it's come about, and most importantly, what can we do to address it? It's an inspiring, eye-opening, wide-ranging, and really insightful discussion. As always, enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Cade London. So you're from the Diversity Joint Venture for Careers in Conservation, and we're here to talk particularly around that. We're here to talk about diversity within the conservation movement, why it's important, any kind of imbalance or deficits that we're kind of seeing within the diversification of the conservation community as a whole, and some kind of topics around issues around the issues it creates for the movement as well, and some of the solutions we can possibly see as well. We've talked before about this. I've really enjoyed our conversations about it, so I'm really delighted that you joined us for the podcast today.
I'm glad you have me.
Yeah, let's start at the top then. Let's talk about the diversity deficit. This is a phrase I've heard you and others use before about the conservation movement. What do we mean by the diversity deficit?
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. And thanks for the question. I think that there are different ways to characterize the diversity deficit in the conservation field, but the way that I think makes the most sense to think about it is that based on data that we have across the conservation sectors, which include the private sector, the nonprofit sector, states, etc., we see that diversity overall is not representative of what we would think we would see based on populations, at least here in the US. I can't speak to internationally, but here in the US, we don't see the diversity in the field that we would expect. And what we've begun to understand is that this is a problem that is larger than any of our one sectors, that we see that the absence of diversity seems to have found its way into sort of all of these spaces. And so then the question one has to ask oneself is, well, if they're nowhere, then where are they? Because obviously, we do know that there are certain degrees that are becoming very popular. Environmental justice is a very popular degree. Environmental policy is a very popular degree. We've seen a decline, I think, of the hard sciences in terms of interest there, but there's still a ton of folks that are very interested in conservation. Climate change, I think, is a topic that folks in sort of Gen Z and others, millennials as well, are very, very passionate about and have spent time studying and actually dedicating some of their schooling to. And so then you have to wonder, where'd they go? And that, I think, is where the deficit really happens, is that there's an inconsistency between interest and the diversity that we see in organizations across the field.
And do you see that particularly the kind of postgraduate level? So people leave university, they leave their training, the topic that's perhaps interested them, and then when they're looking to find employment, that's like a key gap where there's almost like a filter that goes through, and some people stay in and some people drop out, and if so, like what?
That's exactly right.
Right. Yeah.
That's exactly right. In fact, it's incredibly concerning, and we're only beginning to scratch the surface of this now, realizing sort of a function of how diverse are the pool of applicants applying for a lot of these jobs and how many of these diverse applicants are actually getting through. What we're seeing is exactly as you described. It's basically, it's the postgraduate sort of fall off that happens where, these folks graduate and we have reason to believe that they're out there applying for these jobs initially, But we also have data that suggests, based on some information that was provided to us from the Wildlife Society, that folks will only stay in the job market looking for a certain set amount of time. And then if they're unsuccessful in getting into these career fields, then because they have student loans and everything else, they just can't sustain basically being unemployed and begin other trajectories into other careers, where you're for an environmental, policy specialist, you probably aren't going to be a banker, but you find something else that's compatible. It may not be environmental, but, is a job that's going to cover your student loans, et cetera. And that's, I think, exactly it. Why is it that we have all of this diversity applying for these jobs, and then when we actually look at those that are being accepted and then promoted within these organizations, there's a whole different topic on that in terms of the upward mobility of folks from diverse backgrounds. We're not seeing that, and I think that that's a huge issue.
Do you have any facts or figures, anecdotally or otherwise, to hand to kind of characterize, the deficit within the conservation movement? An example I heard recently, and forgive me if I got this wrong, but I believe that in the UK, only about 6% of professional conservationists are Black or people of color, I guess. Yeah. And I find that astounding, but I think it's probably true.
Yeah.
Do you have a similar feel for the US or for your audience?
Yeah, so it's a complicated question, in part because we sort of track this slightly differently depending on the sector. So, for us in the feds, we have the civilian labor force statistics based on certain fields of expertise that we would expect to see certain diversity in. And what we do know is we have an underrepresentation in a lot of our minority groups. And so while I don't have a specific fact and figure to give on that, and I wouldn't want to give you the wrong information there, we do see that as being prevalent in the Fed side. In the NGO side, the state side, the private sector side, while I don't have data on that, in my conversations with folks in leadership positions who represent these sectors, I think that we do see the same struggle. I think that, comparatively to the population we have here in the US, again, we see basically not the representation that we would expect to see. And I think that it gets even, to add another layer to this, you could look even further and look at sort of the graduation rates of people of color and see that that's not representative either. So all of those data sets, I think, overlay each other in a way. And when we look at that, we say, okay, this is clearly something bigger than a supply issue in terms of, the interest being out there. The interest is there. It's definitely something, like you said, sort of that postgraduate that highlights that concern.
Yeah. So there's a positive message in there, isn't there? That there is the interest there.
Yes, absolutely.
The movement. We need people in the movement. The conservation as a whole needs more people working within it. We're losing the battle globally, and the more diversity within that, then the more balance and more impact we can have across different communities, different ways of working, and there's all sorts of spill-off benefits which we can talk about, and I look forward to that. Right. What do you think is driving the drop-off between university and employment? Where's that coming from? I'm sort of thinking it through as I'm talking as well. Thinking, is it to do with perhaps affluence? Have I got that wrong? Is it, if it's about how long it takes to secure that first paying job, then, obviously people with deeper pockets within their family or person, they can wait out a bit longer. I mean, have I missed that? Is it something else?
No, I think you're right, but I would suggest it's interesting. Affluence and sort of, if you want to call it sort of, the privilege of sort of access, if you want to call it that, actually, I think begins before students graduate, and the graduation becomes symptomatic of what happens earlier. Right. So I'll walk you through an example. Then I think we've talked about this, where I think that there are three things that really need to happen for undergraduate students and graduate students. It's sort of the same thing. Yep. That often don't happen for students of underserved backgrounds and do happen for students with fully served backgrounds. And so the first part of that is an awareness of where their education is going to take them. So let's use sort of an example of a Hispanic female who identifies LGBTQ+. I love to use that example because I think it represents a lot of opportunity and sort of where some of the issues are here. Mm-hmm. So that student may or may not know what they want to do, but let's just say that they have an interest in working with butterflies, right? Mm-hmm. So they want to work with butterflies. And so they go and they take a biology degree at their university. They graduate with perfectly good marks. They then look for a job, can't find a job, apply everywhere, nobody takes them. What happened? Well, we could go all the way back to the degree itself and ask the question, just because you have a biology degree, were the classes as a part of that curriculum sufficient for what you're applying for? What we see is in the conservation field, and this is a challenge that I've been working with sort of the broader community to face, is that there is a desire for specialization, especially in the hard sciences and biological sciences, that I think is problematic, because a student who comes out the general biology degree who lacks specifics, in our case, for example, we have in the federal government job series that require hepatology, mammalogy, zoology, botany, all these things that may or may not be a part of that course curriculum.
Yep. That
person's just not going to be competitive, and not knowing that in advance at the point that you graduate becomes basically an albatross around your neck that you can't alleviate unless you go back to school, which when we again talk about people who can afford to do that versus who can't afford to do that, there's a huge gap that happens there.
Right.
But additionally, in addition to coursework, that same student that we were just talking about, if this person had to work a job in the summer, like an actual job, a paying job in the summer to make ends meet, they're competing against colleagues who may have been taking internships at NGOs, et cetera, that are unpaid internships. Yeah. And if you sort of compound that over 4 years of study as an undergrad, you have 4 summer-long internships, so you're talking, 3-month internships times 4, you've got a huge now experiential gap that's now separating your 2 groups as well. So that student who comes out is competing against people who have these, basically year experience to be able to compete with. And I think that's a very unfair position for someone to have to come out of. And then the last thing I would say before graduation that happens is that if you happen to get lucky and have a professor who knows someone who knows someone who knows someone in the field you're trying to get into, then that person advises, hey, speak to so-and-so, and they will advise you on perhaps special on-ramps that are available in terms of, we call them special hiring authorities in the federal government, but these are sort of the silver bullet type programs where if you successfully compete for those, you don't have to go through the general applicant pool of USA Jobs, et cetera. And getting in there, your competition is, maybe 1 in 200 or 400 compared to USA Jobs, which you're 1 in 3,000 for a job position potentially. So that becomes its own barrier also. And so if you consider that same student compared to another student, it's just apples and oranges by the time they graduate. The grades and the degree are almost ancillary to all of these other advantages that were provided to others. And I think that that's a huge part of it. So when we talk about affluence and sort of the fully served, it extends all the way through and trickles in. And by the time that I think you have a graduate and you're looking at 2 resumes, because, that's another challenge, I think, when we might talk about that too, in terms of the bias that goes into sort of resume checking and stuff like that, you have a pile of folks that just never get even looked at because they don't have all those things. And so naturally it gravitates towards those who had the life circumstances to do all of those things successfully.
Yeah, I think you put it really clearly, really eloquently. Yeah. And it's interesting to kind of reflect that it sort of starts at universities and how courses might be shaped and their syllabus, and what are we training people for jobs that are out there? We provide them the skills that makes them employable in the first case. And perhaps academia isn't the most dynamic, nimble place. It can be very slow to evolve and very slow to change. So we're teaching courses that were maybe designed 20, 30, 40 odd years ago, and not perhaps actually, presenting people into the workforce with the skills that they require. Yeah.
And I'd even say it goes even both ways. I find this to be a really interesting issue, and it's a philosophical one. So one has to ask oneself, if you have, and universities are businesses, right? And so if you have a bunch of students who want to learn something and the university accommodates that as a business, but the job market at the end of that isn't available for that, then what's happening? Who is at fault here, right? So let's just consider, something like environmental justice, or even like human dimensions in the environment. These are, I think, 2 areas that we're seeing quite a bit of growth overall in terms of people being interested in these topics. And yet, I can say that from our side in Fish and Wildlife, that the number of opportunities for that compared to a Section 7 biologist doing ESA consultations is night and day, astronomical differences in terms of what's available.
Mhm.
So is it on us as the conservation world to say, well, people are really interested in this. And very likely these are topics that are going to be of high concern because these students obviously represent the communities that they come from, who obviously have a strong feeling on some of these things. Do we need to start creating these opportunities? Or do we, like you said, go to university and say, well, it's great that you're basically selling these classes and these degrees, but we don't have the jobs for that. Like where, it's probably a little bit of both, right? It's probably that we need more opportunities, but we also need to be speaking to universities and saying, we only have this much space right now. We're trying to grow it in the future, but you have a sort of a potential for a lost generation of students if we don't have those opportunities as a conservation community available overall.
Yeah.
So that's something that also keeps me awake at night, is this mismatching, which gets back to that whole deficit that I think we see.
Yeah.
Deficit of careers.
Yeah, and it's part of the reason actually, which I sort of set up conservation careers in the first place, is to try and address the lack of a clear career path into the movement, into the sector, if you like. I think if you want to go into lots of other jobs, there are quite clear career paths. Think about like teaching or lawyer or banker or whatever it might be. You tend to do this, and then you do that, and then you do the other thing, and you kind of know where you're going. Whereas conservation that's been, I think, totally lacking for 95% really of the kind of the work that's out. It's a big diverse from a jobs perspective, pool of work that is growing and expanding all the time. And yet we're not providing clarity for people when they're making key decisions in their life, 15, 16, 17, 18, thinking about university and everything else that goes alongside that, to help them to kind of to connect to their passion. And that's something that keeps me awake at night too, actually.
It is, yeah.
People want to dedicate their lives to doing this and helping. And actually, we're lacking that transition at the moment.
Absolutely. And I think it's a huge shame. I mean, it's also, it's incredibly unfair in a sense that, we expect students to somehow have this crystal ball that many of us conservation professionals, 10, 20 years in, don't even glean until, basically sort of the high point of our career, to be able to look down the mountain and say, oh, that's how that looked. And man, if I could go back in time and do this differently, I would have done X, Y, and Z. Yeah. And yet, despite having the experience of this and the knowledge of this, and the desire, I think, to share that information, which is why I'm very excited that, we as a conservation community are talking about this, it still remains a gigantic gap. Yeah. And I think that's a huge problem.
So if we could ultimately change how people study to make them more employable, across society, there's still two other issues you mentioned there, aren't there? One is about how a voluntary experience tends to favor those who can access it, for reasons of personal income or wealth, or whatever you want to describe that. And the final one was almost like the inherent bias within, for want of a better word, like the old boys network, the old boys club, the introductions, which are out there. I guess before we get into solutions, I really want to talk about solutions as well. But what are some of the issues that result of this diversity deficit within the market, if it is dominated by, let's say, white males like myself? What's the outcome of the movement? Is that causing problems that even holds the wildlife conservation back a little?
It absolutely does. I actually, there's an example that stands out in particular distinction to me because I was closely involved with it. Not wanting to give too much away, since some of this is still being worked on and is sensitive. There was an issue fairly recently with a migratory bird initiative out on the East Coast. And part of how this migratory bird initiative works is it involves state agencies, the private sector, private individuals rather, the feds and others. And what is being worked on is basically when these migratory birds are flying down the coast, they're nesting on beaches all along the coast. And there's nesting in a lot of these beachfront communities. And historically, there's been a voluntary workforce that has been willing to monitor the status of these birds in their nests all day, every day. So we're talking, 2 a.m, you have volunteers out there making sure these nests aren't being predated upon by cats, rats, and dogs, et cetera, that people aren't disturbing them if they're walking along the beach.
Yeah.
And many of these volunteers are people of color. Well, incidents have been happening where at 2 a.m, these individuals are doing their jobs, monitoring these these nests on the beach, and then people within the community will sometimes call law enforcement saying they see somebody on the beach acting suspiciously, right? And then suddenly you have law enforcement involved with these folks that are there totally, appropriately doing this work. They have an explanation as to why they're there, and and end up in these very uncomfortable circumstances. And after that happens enough times, these folks choose to not come back. And suddenly you have a conservation issue that's also a diversity issue. If you can't get these folks actually out there monitoring these nests at all hours of the day, very, very kind of them to do so. And even if they're being paid seasonally, if they're not willing to basically be harassed for that, you suddenly have a very high potential for this species to be impacted, adversely and irrevocably, effectively. And I think that is where rubber really meets the road. Where if we don't become a more inclusive environment, if we don't tackle this diversity challenge that exists in the conservation field, if we don't get ahead of situations like this, where suddenly we have a retention issue as well, where these folks don't want to come back. So whatever little diversity we have, we're bleeding that out as well because we haven't been able to sort of get our fingers around this. I think that this is going to become the norm. Cases like this are going to become the norm. And even more importantly, the community that you need to have engaged in conservation, because all conservation is local, right? Like there's the idea of sort of national policy when it comes to conservation, but all real conservation happens locally. If those communities whose kids are out there doing this work don't feel like their kids are safe, there's never going to be the support you need to actually do that work where it's most needed locally. And eventually sort of the political will erodes, and eventually the issue dies on the vine. That's the risk. The risk is that all of this work, as the nation becomes more diverse, as the world becomes more diverse, has, I think, a great potential to fizzle into insignificance to the public mind, if you want to call it that, because the public mind changes as our demographics change. And I really worry about that.
And it makes me reflect also, we've said it before on the podcast, but a lot of people get into conservation because they really care about animals or plants or whatever it might be that inspires them within the natural world. And quite rapidly, I think people realize actually conservation is all about people, at the local level, just like you say, conservation happens locally. And in order to do that, 9 times out of 10, you need to be working with local people, with the local community, however you want to characterize that. And if it's always people from outside a community that sort of parachuted in to, form the solutions and, and enact whatever it might be, and then perhaps over time leave again, that's not a sustainable solution. It's not something that local people are necessarily going to aspire to and attach to. Really, the best conservation comes from within the communities. It's developed by the people on the ground who are there, who care about it, and and that is sustainable. And for that to happen, you need diversity. It's full stop.
Exactly. No, that's exactly it. I mean, conservation savior syndrome, I think, is a real problem where, we have a ton of interest. We say, this is something that we care about. Who's we? Is we, like you said, the people that parachute in? If it's us that care, and the people who are actually literally living in that space say that it's not our highest priority for any number of reasons, it becomes, I think, a very, very awkward situation. And that's a part of why you really need to have that buy-in. You need to be there in the beginning, and you need to be engaging folks in this work. And if you're not, even if you're successful, there's almost a 0% chance it's sustainable, because these issues aren't a one-time fix. They're ongoing fixes. And even just from, let's say you did somehow have the ability to somehow sustain that, economically and resource-wise, it makes no sense. You're just constantly pouring in something to try to stop, this gushing wound that the only solution is to be working with the local community for.
Yeah. from a donor perspective, why would I keep funding? This isn't going to last forever.
Right.
I haven't got that sustainability built in. Yeah. There's another point actually we touched on just before we hit record that you made, I think, really nicely, which is around preaching to the converted a little bit too within our movement. I think we're really good at talking to those that are already on side,
very good,
already love what we do, already support what we do. And my word, we're grateful and thankful for them.
Yep.
But actually, it's still only a small bubble within the huge picture. And again, we're losing the battle as conservationists. We still need to do so much more to have impact and to reverse declines that we're seeing everywhere. The way to do that is to bring more people into the movement, attract more people, raise more support. And you can't do that just by sticking to the same types of people that we already speak to. And
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I find it really, really interesting because this is something that, really I have a hard time swallowing, where we claim success when all of our best friends show up to the party. well, of course, that's what we would expect. They wouldn't be our best friends otherwise if they didn't show up to the party. But yeah, it's exactly that. It's how do you get that? I would call them sort of the easily convertible, who actually care about these issues, but aren't dialed in on a daily basis to take some action. When I say some action, I'm not talking about these folks suddenly picking up shovels and helping do trench work in a refuge, for example. Like that's not the extent of engagement that I think is reasonable to expect. But what I am saying is that these are folks that probably will never find our content on social media or in news articles or any of that, but could find it interesting through other contacts. When we talk about sort of expanding the pie, I think that there's a huge opportunity to work with social media influencers, individuals who are in adjacent spaces to us that are not directly conservation, but sort of the ag community, et cetera, for example. All of these spaces that have folks that care about these issues and could be tapped to do something immediate for them that could be helpful, even if it's something simple like penning a letter to well, I need to be careful about saying penning letters to Congress, so I will not advise on that. But sort of being willing to get involved with issues that are meaningful to them. I'll just say that instead. I think that is something that, if we were to do that well and expanded our reach into that demographic of individuals, I think we would find a much greater likelihood of success, if you will, on a lot of our bigger conservation jobs. Because a lot of what sort of makes something happen is a threshold of public support. And that public support is very murky. It's very hard to define, but when it happens, right? When there's that tipping point. Like, for example, the social justice movement that's happened in the United States very recently. I think it was very clear that there was a very strong tipping point that moved that needle over. And being able to reach into sort of this broad demographic and get your feelers out there and have that opportunity to connect between sort of the ride and die folks that we've had forever that are ardent conservationists and that new community of converts collectively, I think, could be enough to tip a lot of these big issues over. Yeah.
And you see social media influencers as a good example of a way of reaching the right demographic, if you like, in a new way. There's that kind of volume. Yeah, I do. I think I've really studied this issue, and I've tried to think about other ways to do this. Traditionally we've used articles in various journals. We've had television ads. We've had all kinds of things. But I think there's, in my opinion, there is not a tool that is more effective right now than social media in terms of the breadth of reach. I think that it's a tool that needs to be used thoughtfully. I don't think that it's a panacea for everything, for example. But I do think when it comes to acquiring new audiences and getting them to then use other sources of content to sort of figure out action steps and things that can happen after that, I do think that there's not a better way to go about it. And I think that we've seen some very interesting issues arise in social media recently that we need to be mindful of in terms of how much the conservation community wants to be involved in a lot of that. But right now, I think it's the big show in town that gives the
broadest amount of reach, and most frankly, also the most equitable amount of reach in terms of being able to just put something out there that's highly accessible to a very large audience.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Really fascinating. Let's talk a bit about the diversity joint venture for careers in conservation that you're manager of, that you're heavily involved in, along with many other things. I could talk about your life forever, but
oh boy, that's
so much interesting stuff going on. But let's talk about the diversity joint venture for careers in conservation. You're obviously seeking to tackle this diversity deficit, this issue that we're discussing here today. So, what is it, what is it that what is it you're trying to achieve, and how can people sort of get involved in it? Sort of describe it to us. Obviously, it's a solution to
problems. So it's I think really, the way I describe the diversity joint venture, it's one of those big audacious goals that everyone thinks is a great idea, but no one is quite sure how to do. And so to describe, what it is first, the diversity joint venture is a non-incorporated informal partnership of various conservation sectors who have a commitment to increasing diversity in the conservation field overall. So our partnership includes folks in the private sector, NGOs, states, tribal organizations, universities, et cetera. And effectively, what we've been trying to do is to build a space where, despite what our differences could be on certain conservation topics, if we agree that diversity and conservation is a good thing and we all stand to benefit from it, can we create a space to tackle some of these issues on a system-wide level, as opposed to just on a sectoral level or even an organizational level? And a part of what I think makes the diversity joint venture very interesting, I'm Fish and Wildlife, I work for Fish and Wildlife, but Fish and Wildlife is merely one part of the DJV. So I'm speaking from sort of the DJV as a whole. Is that I think it's very difficult to imagine any one organization being willing to take this on. And there's a number of reasons why. I think that if you think about bettering the conservation field as a whole, you also must implicitly understand that you're also trying to benefit your competition. So imagine any single NGO trying to do this, to say, let's create a space where everyone in the NGO world, let alone sort of just the broader conservation field, has access to the best talent, the most diverse talent. Wouldn't that be wonderful? I think that's a very hard sell to make in these times where there is, because of the deficit that we talked about, a very, very high demand for diverse talent. It's hard to do that, but by using this umbrella of the diversity joint venture and saying, well, not so dissimilar from the biological principle of lekking, where you have sort of all these birds gathering together. If we work in that way, we all will benefit. And if we sort of concede that this larger partnership that's informal is doing the work, then none of us sort of personally experience from our organizational level the same risk, if you will, trying to do it on our own and helping out everyone else in that way. And so, that's sort of the what. As to more specifically, how are we achieving that? We've been working together with the broader conservation community. I know Conservation Careers was a participant in our recent focus group that we hosted several months back, where we're looking at trying to build systems and tools that can be used open source by partners to access that diverse talent. I know that sounds somewhat arcane, but let me explain in a little more detail. We're currently working on developing an online tool that would be able to match students who use the tool to jobs across the conservation sectors. And that sounds okay, well, what makes that special? Well, you could, for example, just go to Indeed.com or Texas A&M job board and find these opportunities, and that wouldn't be difficult, but none of that is tailored to any individual student. And we talk about sort of fully served versus underserved. Some of what enables, I think, folks to navigate a lot of the available resources out there is that mentorship, is that leadership, is a lot of that sort of background knowledge that not everyone has access to. What we're trying to do is to build a tool that is sort of that mentor in the form of an algorithm. So going back to our student from before, if that student were to put their resume into this system in their freshman year and then say, this is what I've done in high school, here are the classes I'm taking, here's where I'm going, We wanted the algorithm to be able to say, oh, that's wonderful. You love butterflies? Great. Tell us where you think you want to work. The private sector, the NGOs, states, feds, you name it, tribes, select all that apply. And they do so. And says, wow, you've selected a lot of folks. Well, the skills that you need, depending on these sectors that you've identified, may differ, and some of these things may overlap. If you want to narrow things down, you can. Here are the things that you might want to narrow based on these things. And if you do want to sort of spread fire to everything, you're going to have to cover a lot of bases. So get cracking. And that tool then grows with the person, so that as their resume updates, we will be working on an algorithmic model in the background that constantly updates their profile as to what their next step is. These are the classes, these are the internships, these are the opportunities that you should be looking at each individual step. So by the time that the student comes out, the model has grown with them over that 4-year period, or even longer if they're going and doing a post-grad master's program or PhD. So the point that when they get out, they should, if we were to sort of fold names over, they should look as competitive as anybody else. And I think that, the issue of how do you do internships if they're unpaid, that's something else we can get into, but we're working on ways for the algorithm to connect these students with opportunities for funding for that as well. So we're building this model right now, and we don't know quite what it's going to look like. I think it's very, very experimental. Everyone who we've spoken with about this says it sounds like a brilliant thing. It sounds scary, and it sounds like I don't know how we do that. But we have some really amazing folks in the tech sector working with us to build this tool. And we're looking forward to being able to show it to partners in the near future, and then build upon that and say what works, what doesn't work, and how do we make it better.
Yeah, it sounds so exciting. And I can kind of sort of hear the energies you describe it too. And it like just sort of imagining how a tool like that would work to be able to sort of track where you are and where you're going. But then it sounds like the trick is like helping people then to bridge that and give people a plan. Very much the career plan we talked about before, like this is your next step, break it down to achievable things. And hey, this is where you can access funding. This is the internship. This is the next course that would take you in that direction. Yeah.
Exactly.
And it would be neat, and maybe this is what you're thinking in terms of like from the employer's perspective, like employers can almost plug into a system like that and see the recruits that are coming their way. You
nailed it. You nailed it. There's two sides of the system. There's a student side, and then there's an organizational side, and we're working on both. But I think you're exactly right. I think, what I would like to be able to do, recognizing, there's Privacy Act information that we need to be very careful of as to how information gets shared and used.
Right.
But I think that it would be very useful to organizations to see trends in who's in the conservation field and who's interested. So just like we described before, universities know this information because they know who their graduating classes, what their graduating classes are, how large these classes are, who's in these classes, et cetera. Yep. But the conservation field doesn't have this information. And so, imagine if you were using this tool and you're just, some NGO out there who has access to this data, and you saw that there was a gigantic spike in fisheries, biologists that were coming down the pipeline, and in 4 years are going to see them. Yep. Well, I'd be very, very excited if I were an organization that had, a fisheries background, and I would be thinking, how can I, like you said, sort of prepare and connect these students, especially at that internship phase early on, where I could, be reaching out and sort of, providing the tool information to give those students and say, hey, we have this opportunity. We saw that you're interested in fisheries work. We'd love to have you. And if we can make that happen, we would be delighted for it. That's what I see as the future, is like you said, sort of almost like a blind dating app in some ways that kind of combines the best of both worlds, where both sides are getting paired together based on information that they're putting into it.
Sounds great. That sounds great. What non-committal, but what are your timescales for something like this? If people are listening and thinking that sounds fantastic, when should I get involved?
Well, I can tell you this. I'm delighted to say that the person who I'm working with at the Department of Interior, she is incredibly sanguine about being able to do things very, very quick. And I'm the pessimist that says that I think that we're going to need to, build in a buffer to see if it works.
Double it and add some, yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I hope to be able to have a prototype available as soon as February, maybe late February, which we plan on showing to the partners group that we had at our first focus group session, which was that 35 partners meetup that we talked about, and to be able to sort of flesh out what works and what doesn't work. It's important to realize that there are really two parts of the tool that need to be developed. Part one is the user interface to make this usable for organizations and usable for students. Obviously, the tool is no good if it's this incredibly arcane, mess that's just difficult to navigate and difficult to use and difficult to understand. So that user interface is one part that we're designing, but then also designing the algorithm in the background that actually is a model that can, sort of basically scrape information off of resumes, off of job boards, off of all these things to put all this together is something else that needs to be developed. And I think that for what we're offering in the prototype, or we're planning to offer in the prototype, that algorithmic part is going to be very, very simple. I mean, we can make it more complicated, but initially it's going to be a very simple tool just to show how it would work. I think we're spending more time right now building what we think is a friendly user interface to show partners initially and to show students initially to say, what do you guys think? Does this make sense? And if that works out, then we would continue to develop the algorithm in the background.
Yeah.
But February, right, I think, is reasonable for the user interface.
So you're like developing like a proof of concept, if you like, to show how this could work, like a minimum viable product, get it out there, get some feedback, and then refine from there. Yeah, really exciting stuff. Yeah, really exciting. I'm pleased to see where it's going. I look forward to February, March time, I guess. Yeah. And while I've got you on, I'd love to know a little bit more about you, Cade, as well, like in your role and your job, if that's all right. So you work for US Fisheries and Wildlife. The Diversity Joint Venture is just a part of what you do. Is that correct?
It is. Yeah. So I need to be mindful that, again, I'm really here speaking on part of the Diversity Joint Venture.
Yep.
But I do work, yes, for Fish and Wildlife. My portfolio covers diversity partnerships more broadly. I think, speaking now somewhat selfishly for our own agency, there's a ton of work that we're really, really interested in the diversity space in terms of urban wildlife refuges, for example, being mindful of how we engage communities in a lot of our conservation work and all of that. And my background is as an environmental scientist. I actually studied in Wellington, New Zealand initially, and then I went to Vermont law and got a degree specializing in public utility law. But despite that background, I now find myself doing diversity work. I'm a fifth generation local, born and raised in Hawaii. And so to me, I think this has sort of become a very personal issue in terms of ensuring that really diverse perspectives are heard sort of at the highest levels when decisions are being made. I think that what we've seen, we touched on this as well, is that there's a lack of diversity in the conservation field, but there's an acute lack of diversity in leadership levels across the conservation sector. And so, I've been very, very lucky, and I've considered it a privilege to be able to serve in this capacity to really sort of try to represent two sides of this. One is, being a diverse individual myself, speaking about that and trying to speak out about the need to increase diversity at leadership levels across the conservation field, but also sort of the reality check, I think, that has to be had, which is that the work necessary to increase diversity at leadership levels is quite the challenge. It's not as simple as just saying, well, we care about diversity and you should feel welcome. I think that there's much more than that needs to be done from a retention perspective and a promotional perspective. And I've been also lucky enough to mentor incredible individuals in the conservation world that are also of diverse backgrounds, and I've shared with them sort of how I got to where I am. But it's not been a linear path. It's definitely been much more complicated. And I would say that as much of a highlight as this is for my career, I've also been very, very pleased to have served at one point as a domestic focal point for the United States for the Ramsar Convention on Weapons of International Importance. And so in that capacity, I also saw, again, flipping back to diversity, how important globally it is, as you spoke from your organization, the UK, to really have that diversity represented. And it got me thinking in that capacity that we're looking at, yes, a national issue, but also a global issue in terms of ensuring equity in the conservation field.
And something clearly close to your heart. Do you think now is, it's a very timely moment for us to be focusing on this as a real issue and tackling it as a kind of sector-wide problem? And do you think it's that tipping point that you mentioned before?
I do. I think that, honestly, what scares me is I don't think that there is a better time to do it than now. And even with this being the best time, we're seeing an abundance of challenges. I think, speaking honestly, I think that diversity has become a very, very hot and happening topic right now. I think that a lot of organizations are spending a lot of energy to show an interest in diversity, but I use that expression carefully, to show an interest, because I think that's very different than taking steps necessary to really increase diversity in the conservation field. I think that the way I describe it is that there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, but nobody wants to make the roast. Everyone wants to basically throw their garnish on the top of it. And the work that's necessary to really, be in the kitchen doing the cooking, I think has yet to be demonstrated on a conservation field-wide basis that it needs to. It involves a lot of trial and error. It involves, I think, being willing to seem foolish. Even as a diverse individual, I feel foolish all the time, because obviously I don't know the experiences of all the diverse communities out there that have a stake in these things. And I say things and do things all the time that I regret and try to be better about. But we have to be willing to do that. We have to be willing to lean into that. We also be willing, I think, to take some risk in terms of trying things that we aren't sure of in terms of financially or otherwise, to really engage diverse communities in the conservation that's meaningful to them. And so, yes, to answer that question, I don't think there's a better time. And I worry that it's sort of become a case of, a duck swimming where, it looks calm on the top, but there's just, thrashing about at the bottom. But, at this point, the duck doesn't seem to be really going anywhere either. So I think that there needs to be a lot that can happen and should happen if we're to take advantage of the moment.
And if I could sprinkle some fairy dust and I made you the conservation czar for the day, maybe let's make dangerous. You the CEO of the TNC, Nature Conservancy, or Wildlife Conservation, or whatever WWF. Let's make you, real head honcho in the movement. You already are, right? But let's make you even higher. What would you seek to change? What would you like to achieve?
Oh, it's so funny you mentioned that. I know a lot of those individuals in those organizations, so I'm incredibly hesitant to even answer, because they're wonderful individuals. They do excellent work.
Let's make it an imaginary organization.
Yeah, imaginary, yes, the imaginary organization.
The Global Wildlife Firm.
Yes, the Global Wildlife Fund for the best things in the universe. Exactly.
Yep, that one.
Okay, so what would I change if I could change anything?
Yeah, if you were seeking to tackle diversity specifically, obviously.
So I think the first thing that I would do is I would invest a significant amount of resources into using those tools that we talked about earlier in terms of that social media work and that outreach work that I think is necessary for us to reach those new audiences. Once we reach those new audiences, I think it would be important to double down on figuring out what messages resonated with them. In other words, I think what we tend to do in the conservation field right now, that I don't think is the right way to go about it, is we say, there's a problem, you need to care about it.
Yeah.
And we try to basically convince people and sort of browbeat them with facts and figures, etc. But I think more importantly is to sort of thread some stories together and to see what gets traction, and then to bring people in sort of as a solution to these problems, rather than just tell them there is a problem. We see that happening more in the conservation field in terms of sort of that community engagement, but I think that could be done better. I think it would also be that I would invest more heavily in connecting the conservation field together. I mean, that's what the DJV is, and we have a limited amount of resources to do that, but I think that more communication between the pipeline, even high schools and middle schools, for example, sort of, the whole way up the chain would be very, very useful. I mean, so many of us that I think are folks that are a part of the movement, if you want to say, the sort of the choir, are folks that had experiences very early on, by coincidence in some cases, that made them feel passionate about conservation. And so a dedication of resources to engaging families and communities that historically have not wanted to do that because they have not felt included, and they feel, in some cases, pressure to not engage in those activities. It would make sense to work with organizations that would help bridge some of that gap too.
Yeah.
And then also, I think this is also highly controversial. I think we need new voices in the conservation movement. I think that, it's great for you and I to be talking about these things, but I think that we need younger folks that are still actively students and folks that are even just considering whether or not they want to be involved in this, engaged in decision-making very, very early on. The idea of being talked down to and told, you just don't understand how this works. You don't understand the scope and scale of these problems. You can't possibly help. Doesn't make anybody feel good. And it's a huge turnoff, I think, to the future that we, all aspire to leave our conservation ethos to. So I think that another sort of a push to dedicate ourselves to engaging younger folks in decision-making, in challenging issues, would also go a long way to flip things around. But those are just some of the ideas that I'd have. It's a huge and deep question. I'd have to give it more thought, but that's just, off the top of my head, some of where I would begin. But I think that there's more than that.
Thank you. I know it's a horrible question too to kind of to wrap up with, but let's do what you said. Let's do that. I like it. That's wonderful. Yeah. Cade London, it's been such a pleasure reconnecting and talking to you. Thank you so much for jumping on the podcast. I appreciate your time and sharing all your thoughts and everything with us. If people want to find out more about you or specifically about the joint venture on diversity, where should we send them?
Folks can find out more about the diversity joint venture at diversity in conservationjobs.org. You can just find that by also typing in diversity joint venture for careers in conservation into Google. And of course, if folks want to reach out to me, my door is always open in the sense that through the website, you can always send a note that will connect to me in my email, and I'd be happy to respond to folks if they have further interest. And for organizations listening to this podcast, if folks have an interest in connecting, please connect with me through the Diversity Joint Venture. We're always looking for new partners to join us in this movement and trying to really tackle this on a system-wide basis. So we would welcome organizations and their interest in the DJV.
Fantastic. Yeah, and we'll make sure we put a link down in the show notes, everything like that, as we always do. And I can attest that if we send an email to Cade through the website, you do get a response. That's how we connected. So your door is open. I know. I thank you for that. Cade,
it's been such a pleasure.
Likewise, it's been a huge pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks again, Nick.
Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed that, everyone. If you did, then please do hit the subscribe button to get notified of new episodes as they drop. And also please give us a rating or a review, because it really helps us to get in front of more people. Now, if you want our help to get clear and get started and get hired as a professional conservationist, I recommend you enroll in our free online training program, exploring how to get a conservation job. So if you're a student, a job seeker, or a career switcher, you'll learn the golden rule about how to get started, the key mistakes to avoid, and also we'll answer your biggest questions. You can check that out at conservation-careers.com/free. See you soon.